Certainly would like to translate into English Arus Balik, another historical novel that he wrote, set in the, I always get my centuries wrong, in the 16th or 17th century. But my most immediate translation project, I think, would be to translate a new play by the Indonesian playwright Faiza Mazuki. A woman playwright who for a few years now has been writing plays with themes that relate to women's rights and women's liberation. She's just completed a play whose draft manuscript I read, which I think is extremely good, which is explaining the experiences of women political prisoners arrested in 1965 and 1966 and 1967, whose experiences were much more horrific, of course, than the experiences of the male left-wing political prisoners from that period. She hopes to perform that play at the end of this year. I'm hoping in the next couple of months, because it's not too long a play, to actually also produce an English language translation of that. So I'll finish there. I think we will have quite a long time to ask questions if people do have questions to ask. Yes.
Yes, Mr. Max Payne, I have a question for you, and that is, as a Caucasian, how did you adapt to new cultures and get them to accept, your point of view in translating, the historical issues? Because you said earlier that the Indonesians have a very prejudiced view of what their experience with the Dutch, as well as other foreign elements involved in the past. So when you came into being, how did you get them to accept you as a trustworthy translator, and how did you able to get them to adapt to your views?
Well, they weren't required to adapt to my views, because, as I said, as we discussed these issues, turned out we had the same views. I think in Pramudia's case, if you want to define his intellectual, cultural worldview, or his intellectual, cultural kind of ingredients that made up his intellectual, political, cultural worldview, but you can of course get it from his novels. You can see it quite clearly in his novels. But basically he combined. He was somebody who rejected totally. He was Javanese, but he was someone who rejected totally, who took the view that Javanese culture contained more or less nothing of value. He took the view that religion gave nothing of value. What his intellectual ingredients came from what you might call the Enlightenment, European Enlightenment range of philosophical and ethical and scientific works, combined with the ideas that had arisen through the various big revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries, or 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The French Revolution, that goes back to the connection with the Renaissance and Enlightenment. The Chinese Revolution, Sun Yat-sen, and then later on Mao Zedong. The Russian Revolution, so Marx and Lenin. Marx, Lenin, Mao Zedong, Sun Yat-sen, Jose Rizal, plus the contributions made by the Enlightenment. Those were what made up his worldview. And that meant that, from someone coming from my background, that meant there was not such a big gap between myself and them. So that wasn't really an issue. And in terms of winning their confidence, after they saw some drafts of the translation, and after 2 or 3 months we'd exchange views about so many different subjects over over that period of time. It was quite clear to everybody that we are on the same wavelength.
I have another question, I'm sorry. Is it important, as a translator yourself, in the literary sense, does intellectual curiosity comes with great value for yourself? And how do you balance perspective and objective? Or is it versus?
Oh, of course, I think for any serious intellectual activity, curiosity is wanting to understand better, and wanting to know and understanding more is a crucial part of the process, and that was always part of the driving force of conversations we had over the decades. Myself wanting to understand more about how Pramudia understood things, and that was also part of both of us trying to better understand what was happening in Indonesia. So curiosity in that sense. Objectivity, of course, is a tricky concept. In most discourses, objectivity is often incorrectly linked to the idea that you have to balance the two sides. Make sure you don't get tied up in taking one of two sides. Of course, in most cases, there's not two sides. There might be 5 sides or 8 sides. But the real dynamic behind objectivity is nothing to do with sides or balance. Nothing to do with balance. You want to really get to the truth. Of course, if you're passionate about getting to the truth, then your writing and your spirit may be extremely enthusiastic and manifest passion. And then often you find in what's hegemonic in society and culture today, that if you show passion, enthusiasm for your viewpoint, you'll be accused of not being objective. That objective is supposed to show having some distance. No, objective is wanting to actually get to the truth and explain the truth. Of course, you might try and explain the truth and get it wrong, and someone also say, no, what you're saying is wrong. But and then you have a debate or discussion. But I think objectivity is basically about trying to get to the truth and explain the truth. And because I thought Pramudia's writings was getting to the truth, and I think it's one of the reasons they're great novels is they do get to the truth of the origins of where Indonesia came from, because Indonesia did not exist in anybody's mind or anywhere until the 1920s. So these novels are trying to explain where that how that seed was planted. So I think objective in terms of really searching for the truth and trying to explain it, but not worrying about being passionate or enthusiastic about explaining it. I think that was his approach, and certainly in terms of trying to translate his literature and then promote his literature, that's also, I think, the approach I've tried to take. Other questions, comments, dialogues, conversations?
Translator should be passionate about the subject or the text he translates, and he shares the original author's point of view. Therefore, he can just help to bring the truth in the original work across to the target language audience. Yeah, I believe it has been a couple of decades since you started to translate the Indonesian literature. Given that the political landscape has changed, I believe, in the past decades, looking back, do you still, in retrospect, do do you still believe the truth sustained over the years?
I think so. I think absolutely, actually. And I think that also explains why in Indonesia, despite the fact that Indonesian literature, and therefore, of course, Pramudia's books, but Indonesian literature in general is not taught in schools. So Indonesia is one of the most ignorant societies on planet Earth about its own literature, because no one's taught it in school. And it's not in your genes. You have to be taught, you have to be exposed to the literature and asked to read it and discuss it to have any knowledge of it. But if you go to any major bookshop, any large bookshop, in any large city in Indonesia, there's one author who has a table or a section of the shelves for himself, and that's Pramudia. That is, despite the fact that there's no exposure in the school system, despite the fact that there's almost no exposure in the media, because the media is not favorably disposed to people on the left wing of politics, that you can go into Gramedia bookshops, Gunung Agung bookshops, Togamas bookshops, any of the big bookshops, and you'll find, the equivalent, a big table or the equivalent of a big table, which has 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of Pramudia's titles. And the reason is that the people who do read them and then discuss with their friends and contacts about them, it does, and it's a pity not more has been written about this, but it's quite clear that the books strike a chord in the consciousness of a significant number of Indonesians that actually does need further analysis. What is it? I mean, to me, it is the truth. The truth of this is how Indonesia originated, and it has a big impact on people, because if you grasp this was how Indonesia originated, you also grasp how incredibly deep the betrayal has been. So Indonesians who read it and you have discussions with them, it's quite clear that a part of the impact is, on one hand, the novels are set in the beginning of the 20th century and they're trying to be historically accurate as possible. In the process, they explain this was the origins of Indonesia. People started to think about creating something called Indonesia out of a strong sense of solidarity with humanity, out of a strong sense of a desire for equality, out of a strong sense of wanting to understand better the reality of the mass of the population at the grassroots, their reality. That's where Indonesia came from, those kinds of impulses. But if you read it today in a society where, established by the 4 decades of Suharto's rule, the culture that's been established is one of purely material benefit, being a yes man person or a yes woman person. Those two things just dominate contemporary culture, and anyone who reads Pramudia's books, despite the fact that the books are, were not written to be a commentary on contemporary Indonesia. They were written. He started to write them before. He was arrested in 1965. So they weren't written. He started to conceive of them. They weren't written to comment on 1980s Indonesia. They're written to describe what happened. The people who read them, there's an enormous sense of betrayal. This is where my country came from. This is how it started. This is the crap country I have now. And they will use even more coarse words than that to describe the state of the country. So I think the truth still has enormous power of those novels. Sign, there's 10 minutes to go, is that right?
Yep.
We have 10 minutes left, so 1 or 2 more questions.
What will be your 3 key advice for translators going across cross-cultural environments? and takeaways for translators.
Well, one thing is to be clear about, what does cross-cultural mean? Because a lot of the discussion of cross-culturality is based on a very Western or Orientalist definition of what, for example, Asian cultures are, or even what European culture is. I mean, you find in Australia and the United States, for example, a lot of people describing European culture as what they call it, Judaic Christian, when anyone knows that the impact of the Enlightenment was actually aimed against religion. So what is the biggest contribution to contemporary European or Western culture? The legacy of Judaism and Christianity, or the legacy of the Enlightenment, which argued against the church and a lot of its tenets. The same with approach to Asia. The dominant, I think, in most discussion, the dominant idea, the dominant thinking about Asian cultures is that Asian cultures are defined by the Asian cultures that existed 200 years ago. Traditional culture is identified as contemporary culture. But I think actually in the last couple of hundred years, including in Asia, in the different Asian countries, that cultural change has also been very significant. That's why I took the case of, you asked the question earlier about the cultural gap with Pramudia, but Pramudia was someone who rejected Javanese culture. I have never met anybody, I have never met another Indonesian who's of complete Javanese background, who in the 3 decades that I had all these conversations with him, never uttered one word of Javanese. Most Indonesians, especially with a few other Javanese, will say Monggo, which means silakan, matur nuwun, thank you. No. Pramudia never said one word. Never spoke one word of Javanese. His position was it was better if Javanese language was wiped from the face of the earth, except as a, something to be studied like Latin. Because he saw it as feudal and backward, inappropriate and for the contemporary world. He was, and his main criticism, or he identified as one of the main problems of Indonesian culture and society, was that there had never been the equivalent of a Renaissance or an Enlightenment. And for him, that was a problem. So in terms of cross-cultural with him, there was no cross-cultural issues. There might have been a cross-cultural issue between him and somebody some Indonesian Javanese whose thinking was still feudal. Then they might have a clash. But the clash was not between me and him. The clash might be between him and the Indonesian who still had feudal thinking, or whose religiosity was still primarily superstition, not reason, not where the element of reason was weak. He would have a clash. He would have the cross-cultural clash. So I think that's a key thing to remember. Cross-cultural does not necessarily, you should not fall in the trap of defining cultures in terms of traditions. One more question, because we've just been signaled 5 minutes left. One more question to take up the last 5 minutes. No technical language questions, not even one.
Yeah, you mentioned that there's no clash between the translator and the author. What about the cultural contact in terms of language? Australian, English and Bahasa Indonesia.
Well, you do get, there are questions of. it was raised a bit in the audience and it's in the last session, and so it's a debate in translation theory generally. To what extent do you want to eliminate foreignness? The easy example to give in the last 5 minutes, for example, is when I translated Bumi Manusia and I circulated the original draft. A couple of colleagues took issue with that I translated the word buaya, which means crocodile. I translated it as crocodile. It was used to describe Minka in terms of his womanizing, or his attitude, his playboy attitude towards women. They say you should translate it as wolf, because an English language reader will more easily recognize wolf as describing a woman-eating playboy than crocodile. I said, no, first of all, if you use wolf, there's not so many wolves in Indonesia. But secondly, for an English language reader, especially an American reader, wolf is associated with the behavior of the wolf whistle. No, I can't do it myself, but that one. And it's connected to a whole attitude of the teenager, the American teenager. And Minka was not an American teenager. His attitude to women, his playboy activity in Java was a completely different style and nature than playboy activity of a teenager in America who did a wolf whistle. So I said, thank you very much for your suggestion of wolf, but I'm going to stick with crocodile. On the basis also of being fairly sure that the reader will get the context. It's a predatory attitude towards women. And I really never had any complaint from a reader fellow translators will give different analysis, or you should have done this, but from readers, I don't think. And I think you also have to demand of the reader the effort to learn. You have to demand of the reader the effort to learn about something that's foreign. Another one, I just finished another one. How do you translate the word ibu? I turned down the suggestion of translating ibu as mum or mom, because a mum or a mom in America, in Australia, is a completely different sociological phenomenon than an ibu in the early 20th century Java. It's the mom, the American mom, the American mother who exists in the 1950s Indonesia, which gave the 1950s US, which gave strength to the term mom, M-O-M. It's a completely different woman, completely different sociological phenomenon than ibu. So I did what they were talking about this morning. I just left it as ibu in Indonesian. In one or two, in some contexts, I use mother, where it seemed to work. But where using mum or mom gave it the sense you're talking about a mother in contemporary Western society, it seemed to me to be completely inappropriate. But probably now we've used up our time, because somebody kept coming in the back there and holding up a sign, 10 minutes.